Hi, this is almost my last video blog from Gabriola Island and building conscious use of power, the inner activist program. And we did a lot of work today. I have several exercises I could talk about on this video blog. However, I think I'm going to talk about just one of them. The one where we had to kind of go through our identities, marginalized and dominant. And this is something really important to realize when we talk about anti-oppression work, becoming aware of our biases, some of the stuff that I talked about in previous blogs, because many of us, most of us, I don't know if there's anybody who doesn't have a dominant identity, even if they have most of their makeup is marginalized identities. For myself, for example, I have several privileges to do with class, education, cultural gifts, due to my class position. And we had to work through those and kind of think about how those identities worked for us or didn't work for us, what sorts of power they evoked, where we used them in our lives. And to me, a lot of anti-oppression work has been very rigid, very absolute, and very fixed. And one of the great boons of this training for me has been to understand how we can move more fluidly through our identities instead of sort of getting stuck in them. And getting stuck is where, you get a lot of toxicity and you have a hard time relating to others. I know a couple of times during the weekend I sort of, got really angry being stuck in a racialized identity and not really being able to get out of that, see my other privileges or my other powers that I was using. So, the analysis has to be more complicated, has to be more complex because we are more complex as humans. And so one of the things that our identities were formulated in terms of was stages. And it was made clear to us that, it's not like a ladder of ascension where you go from stage 1 to stage 4 and you've achieved some kind of perfection or nirvana as an activist. And that whole enlightenment thing where, you know a whole lot more, you're further along the path. Well, sometimes we just slip right on back to, another stage and where we're unaware and unable to move and stuck. So that was very helpful for me to think of. For example, if you have a marginalized identity, such as a racialized person, stage 1 would be lack of awareness, conformity. So, the lack of awareness of your own oppression, conformity, identification with dominant culture. For me, I grew up in England. I wanted to be English. I was English. There was nothing odd or not fitting about me, except that sometimes other kids would call me Packy and beat me up. So, I just thought, well, you've made a terrible mistake, really. And I didn't really, I guess I had internalized it, but didn't really think about, how that might make me feel. I wasn't aware of what I was being made to carry at that point. Aspirations to be like the dominant culture, whole dominant culture values, a quest to fit in, and an embarrassment of one's own culture or family or friends. And so that's stage 1, where you're just completely in denial about your marginalized identity. And it doesn't have to be racialized. It could be, something else that the person I worked with talked about, being from a divorced family, for example. And, saying that it was easier to pretend that their parent was dead rather than, have to think about the fact that their parent wasn't there. So you see kind of how it works. You want to fit in. You don't want to be different. And then stage 2 is when you get challenged at attempts to pass. You gain awareness of inequalities and discrimination and racism. You get feelings of anger and frustration and hopelessness, and awareness of insecurities and feelings of low self-esteem and self-hatred. I mean, for me, that came when people were, telling Packy jokes and obviously I was passing. I wasn't looking like a Pakistani, as they would point out if I called them on it. And oh, you don't look Pakistani. Oh, well, you're not really, right? But at that point, I became aware of it, because I became aware of how uncomfortable that made me feel. And then stage 3 is sort of a conscious self-definition. You start to withdraw into your own culture, for example, reclaiming, rediscovering. This was when I was in grade 6, and I met a friend who taught me to say "packy" and proud of it. I was like, woohoo, that's powerful. And, focus on your own marginalized identity, but at the same time, a lack of awareness of complexity, right? So that identity may be the only identity you want to talk about or feel for a while. You don't want to think about intersectionality or multiplicity of identities. You may not be willing to consider that you have class power, and your focus is on your social rank. You may be unaware of your personal powers, the things you have, for example, ties to your community, and local advantages and things that spiritual membership in a spiritual tradition, personal characteristics that make you powerful. You may not be aware of those because you're so focused upon your social rank and your position in a social hierarchy that privileges white, able-bodied, heterosexual men, for example. So you may use privileged identities to aid in your fight, but usually with minimal awareness of that privilege. And you're feeling angry and frustrated still, but you have a sort of growing awareness that things may not be as simple as just being a racialized person or just being another marginal identity. And stage 4 is that you have you start stepping out of your binaries and your silos, and you start to re-examine and redefine yourself. You find some kind of ground from which to work that's not necessarily stuck in a particular identity position. You begin to see the other as you, and understanding how you might have dominant identities, and developing inner rank sources, finding gifts in the low social rank status, power, and personal rank sources. For me, this kind of came with my union work, more awareness of class privilege and so on. And also, the awareness that social power was powerful, that I had the ability through music and networking and so on to, work with groups of people, and that I had, drew power and energy from that. So stage 5, which we may never be at, because we're humans, is balance, strength, integration, seeing the other as you, understanding multiple roles, identities, and rank, and working across groups and difference, using your personal power in order to be a good ally and to be effective in the fight against inequality and oppression. Sounds good, right? Well, what about dominant identities? For me, for example, what about my class status? The privileges that have accrued to me as a result of education and, music lessons and all the rest of the stuff I got that other kids didn't get when I was little. So in stage 1, you have sort of a lack of awareness of the impact of difference and diversity. You're like, I just see people as people, right? And we're all, those of us who do anti-oppression work are kind of aware of that stage as a stage of kind of resistance on the part of people in dominant identities, white, straight, male, able-bodied, upper middle class people, cisgendered people who are just, unaware and resisting the idea that they might have privilege. And, because the privilege is the norm or normalized, it's invisible, of course. It wouldn't occur to me to even question that as just who I am. And, everybody goes to university. Everybody gets books. Everybody gets music lessons. Why can't they perform like me, right? So, why can't everybody read? So that kind of privilege. And your identity is gradually, as you move into stage 2, you gain awareness of inequalities and isms, and you get called out for your dominant identities. And these create, being called out creates discomfort and unease, and guilt and feelings of shame about yourself and your group and your family. And in stage 3, which is where I see a lot of work needs to be done, and I frequently find myself there, that you sort of white knight, right? It's guilt driven largely, and you think about guilt and you try to right inequalities, but you do it from a place of privilege where you're healing yourself and your needs, and the focus is on you and your needs and your knowledge of power. This is where the sort of, I feel a lot of that self-righteousness comes from, on the part of activists who are trying to sort of, school, and I won't say teach, but school other people about marginality. So, you only see oppression in the social context, and we talked about social power and personal power. So for you, it's all about the social context, and you don't look at personal power. You're stuck in a binary of oppressed and oppressor and oppression. And there's a lack of awareness of complexity in that picture and the different stories you might be missing. Feelings of guilt, denial, overcompensation, fear, anxiety, and helplessness. Then as we move into stage 4, you get a challenge to your choices and options. You re-examine, you get more information, you redefine yourself, you're able to acknowledge privilege, but you see the cost of that privilege and what gets marginalized, what in your identity, what gets marginalized with that privilege. If you're a man, for example, and you're gendered masculine, maybe you lose that sort of touch with your emotions and your nurturing and your caregiving abilities that are gendered feminine, right? Because your hypermasculinity costs you that ability to relate. And you recognize the complexity of identity and intersectionality, and you become more critical and aware of strengths and weaknesses for all groups and cultures. So, nobody's on a pedestal. Everybody's got their work to do. That doesn't take away or erase the, some of the impacts that are harder and harsher for certain groups. But, at the same time, you're not sort of, appropriating oppression, if that makes sense. And then stage 5, which is where ideally those of us who are privileged would end up, is balance, strength, integration, and action, working across groups and differences and all levels of power. Being, again, it's that fluidity of identity, that ability to move and to honor and respect different positions, and rather than simply just regarding them in absolutist terms as, morally good or morally bad. Awareness of your own privilege, but an active role as an ally. I think tomorrow we're going to explore allyship, using social and personal rank in the fight against oppression appropriately. So if you've got some social and personal power, you use it as a force for good. Recognize internal sources of power, not being limited to external social identities, and understanding the cost of oppression to you as well as to the other. So, going back to that example of being male and being unable to exercise emotional identities. So that's some of the work we did today. Some of it was sort of moving through our family pictures and our patterns and seeing patterns and ghosts carried around from our families, and some of those things that fuel us. And again, always the focus is on mindfulness, on being able to be aware of your body, your breathing, and being able to find a spot that is grounded from which to engage in your battles around activism, and without sort of